So like I said, I'm Devin. I'm one of the 3 co-chairs of the Youth Leaders and Young Professionals program at NGO CSW New York. I apologize if you can hear my cats screaming at each other behind me. But I'm also the program manager at NGO CSW New York. This is our second event of our youth preparation series for NGO CSW 66. So this is the second of 8 events that we'll have. There's events on a lot of different topics. We're going to have some networking events, some educational events like today, some professional development events. So I will put the link in the chat to all the information about the series so you can register for events and check that out. Yeah, and so today we're going to be talking about the CSW 66 priority theme, which is climate change, environmental, and disaster risk reduction. So with that, I will hand it over to Saida. We have a really great lineup of speakers. So yeah, thanks, Saida.
Thanks, Devin. I love it when your cat makes an appearance. It makes my day. So that was awesome. Hi, everyone. Great to meet you all, and good morning, good evening, good night to many of you. My name is Saida Rizvi, and I am one of the co-chairs of CSW's Young Leaders and Young Professionals program. And we have so many members and speakers joining from all over the world. I'm also currently visiting my family in Karachi, Pakistan. So it's like 10 in the evening. We had our dinner and are super pumped for this conversation. And thank you to our incredible speakers for being here. We are so grateful for you for taking this time and being part of this conversation. Now, as many of you know, this year, of course, the CSW priority theme is achieving gender equality and the empowerment of all women and girls in the context of climate change, environmental and disaster risk reduction policies and programs. So this discussion will be incredibly important for our youth members, and we will be recording this conversation. We will be uploading this on YouTube and sharing more broadly with our youth members as well, all across the world. So again, really excited for that. Now, before heading into the discussion, I wanted to provide just a little bit more context on why we speak of climate change and its intersection with gender equity and justice. Now, just as a little bit of a personal backdrop, I remember in 2019 working on a policy brief on climate change and gender equity. And my fiance, upon learning what I was working on, he responded with confusion. He genuinely was perplexed and asked, what does gender equity have to do with climate? Doesn't everybody get impacted by climate change? And it was, for me at least, a very aha moment. It was a wake-up call, because we spend so much time in our respective echo chambers talking to fellow advocates who understand these intersectional nuances, so that it's easy to forget that not everyone is always as informed about these conversations as we would want them to be. But who better to lead the way in changing these narratives than young people? And also grassroots conversations are steadily shifting our own awareness of climate change from this abstract phenomenon about carbon levels to a more tangible, multi-layered issue that is bringing together all kinds of social, environmental, political, and economic struggles to the forefront. And as climate justice advocates, we recognize that the root cause of the climate crisis, that as we take from the earth to produce and consume, we also take resources, lands, and right from others to enable this process. The changing climate resulting from this exploitative process further increases disparities as its impact hits vulnerable populations, who, by the way, have done the least to contribute to this crisis, are in fact the ones who are hit the hardest. And among those at the front lines of climate impact are the bodies, lives, and livelihoods of women around the world, particularly rural women, indigenous women, and women living in poverty. So with that, let's get to our program. Let's get to our wonderful speakers who will talk more about these intersectionalities, these nuances. I will turn it over to our speakers and would love for them to introduce themselves, and then we'll dive into some questions. So we can, starting off with our speakers, we can either popcorn or go alphabetically, but we would just love to hear from you about where you're calling from, a little bit about yourself and your work. So our speakers, who's going to go first?
Hello, my name is First. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, hello, my name is Ṣolanke Ayọmide. I'm an activist and artist from Lagos, Nigeria. I'm also a Girls Rising Fellow. My work focuses on gender equity, climate change, and intersections between climate change actions and gender-based violence in communities of Nigeria. Thank you.
Thank you. Who would like to go next?
You go next. Hello everyone, my name is Alice. And before I jump in, I just wanted to acknowledge where I'm joining you all from today, which is the Gadigal country of the Eora Nation, which all of you must probably know as Sydney, Australia. But I just would like to firstly acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands of which I join you all here today. I would like to also pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and firstly acknowledge that the land of which I join you here was never ceded, sovereignty was never ceded, and I am living on what always was and always will be Indigenous land. A little bit background about myself. So my background is in social work and law, international law. I started off working in mental health, working in forensic mental health, and kind of doing work with Indigenous communities there, and then kind of translated into international development, where I worked mainly focused around children's rights in the Asia Pacific area, and mainly the South Asia Pacific area and Southeast Asia. And now I'm currently working in human rights, where I am the founding director of Voices of Influence Australia. And climate justice is something that's very quickly becoming a very core passion of mine. It's something that doesn't, even though, as I mentioned before, it does affect everyone, it doesn't affect everyone equally, particularly looking at gender vulnerability, but also the gender vulnerability of Indigenous populations, the dispossession of Indigenous people from their states, and also the knowledge that we can draw from, seeing as they've looked after our lands for some cases 60,000 years, and we have so much to learn from them. So I'm interested to kind of bring that into the conversation today as well.
Awesome, thank you, Alice. Any of our other speakers like to go next?
Yeah, I can go. Hi, I'm Jeevika. I'm from India, and I'm also a lawyer and social worker by profession. But I spent about 6-7 years of my life working with rural women, Indigenous women, Dalit women from the lower castes, women who live in the coasts, women who live at the margins, and working on issues of food security, working on issues of, forests, working on issues of basic rights of being able to live sustainably in the communities where their lands have been taken away. I've also been associated with the women farmers movement called the Mahila Kisan Adhikar Manch, and looking at farmers' rights, and within that marginalized rights and labor rights of those who are landless. I've also worked on women's land rights and looking at how do we, work on issues more broad-based. And I think at the intersections of working with climate justice, human rights defenders at this point of time who've been criminalized in large numbers, especially young people in our own state, and especially those from Indigenous communities, from dispossessed backgrounds. And that's my interest in coming here. I also happen to be nominated as a leader to the Generation Equality process in UN Women, a feminist young leader. And I think looking at how the intersections of young people from marginalized communities can speak up and have more space to define what climate justice means is, and I think in general, what does participation of young people from the Global South mean is something that interests me, and I've been part of the Young Feminist Manifesto to open up these sort of spaces and look at what can be done to bring in more grassroots voices. So yeah, thank you for having me, and I'm excited to hear you all.
Awesome, thank you, Jeevika. Right, we have 2 more speakers left. LaTisha and Maneeza, if you can hear us, please feel free to introduce yourselves.
Good morning, afternoon, everyone. I am LaTisha, a climate justice organizer in California, based in the United States. I got my start with organizing in climate justice as I worked on a project about 4 years ago, trying to invest in one of the most disadvantaged communities in the nation, actually two disadvantaged communities in the nation that actually have the highest asthma rates and the highest pollution rates. And as we know, or if you're not aware, pollution and asthma go hand in hand. In these two particular zip codes, 1 in 4 African-American boys are plagued with asthma. So we worked on a few projects to get the nation, the Strategic Growth Council, to specifically invest nearly $80 million into 2 zip codes so that we can begin to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The groundbreaking for those projects actually just launched. I want to say about May of last year. We're actually beginning to see the fruit of the labor of that work.
Thank you, LaTisha. Maneeza, if you can hear her, we'd love to hear from you as well.
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Maneeza, and I'm a 16-year-old from India. Even though I'm young, I believe that we all, especially young people, have the power to speak out and, bring positive change and, have a voice in the policy making, this process and etc. And that's the reason why I joined Girls Learn International around 1.5 years ago. I founded the Kolkata community chapter in Kolkata, and I've been working on menstrual justice and reproductive health in Kolkata and in neighboring regions. I've also been selected and nominated for the AGIP, which is the Adolescent Girls Investment Plan. It's where adolescent girls from all over the world come and give their thoughts and bring about effective policy change in the context of gender equality. And I represent the Global South, and I'm also a GLI delegate at the UNCSW 66. And with my team, we are working on we're working with other girl leaders to build the girl statement and present it to the UN at the end of the UNCSW 66. And I'm excited to speak about kind of like my work and also hear from others about their unique experiences. So yeah, excited to be here.
Wonderful. We're so excited to have you. Thank you for joining us, to all our wonderful speakers. And now we can actually dive into some questions. And one of the first questions we have for all our speakers, and it's relatively a broad one because so many of us come from different contexts and backgrounds and countries and experiences. So our question is, what does climate justice mean to you and why is it important? So I'm gonna let that sink in, but opening the floor to our speakers, whoever wants to take the floor.
I'm happy to start the conversation. For me, climate justice comes back to the fact that climate change, climate disasters, how we understand it now, is absolutely and fundamentally a human rights issue, particularly towards and only exacerbates gender vulnerabilities and completely divides gender inequality so much further. You'll have to forgive me, it's 4 a.m. here in Australia and my brain's still catching up. But for me, I think climate justice, again, always comes back down to Indigenous knowledge. And I would also first like to say that I am by no means an authority on Indigenous knowledge. I am a very strong ally and will always be an ally for Indigenous knowledge and using it for climate justice issues. But for me, it's a chance for us to decolonize our knowledge about climate change and recognize that, as I mentioned before, Indigenous people have been looking after these lands for 60, 80,000 years. They did a fantastic job of it. And we have so much to learn from them. And so particularly Indigenous women leadership and climate justice as well is something that I'm really passionate about. That's probably, I'll leave it at that for now.
Thanks, Alice.
I can go next. I really agree with what Alice said. I do believe that Indigenous people have a huge role in helping us against a fight against climate change. Specifically, for me as like a young girl from the global South region, this is a cause very passionate to my heart, because I know that this issue will directly impact my people in the coming years. It has already started to impact my people, and I do realize that as the youth of tomorrow, and also like kind of like the leaders of the next future generations who will face tremendous impact, I believe that we are the only generation left who can actually bring some change before, you know, catastrophe strikes. So this is definitely a cause very close to my heart. For me, climate justice is not only about finding solutions to the climate crisis, but also doing it in a way which creates a fairer, more just, and more equal world. Because really, climate justice is also, as many speakers have said, it's really like an equal, it's like a human right issue as well. And therefore, like for me, to educate people and also like to get more people aware of this is so important.
Awesome. Thank you, Maneeza.
So I would have to say climate justice is pretty much the fight for addressing the ethical and moral issues behind those that are impacted the most by climate change, those that are the least contributors, as stated earlier, that are impacted the most, whether it's by hurricane, whether it's by fracking, whatever it is that may be happening, those that are impacted the least are impacted the most. We're fighting for them heavily.
So I would go ahead. Can you hear me? I would go ahead and agree with what LaTisha and Maneeza has said. Climate justice is just the collective efforts we see at reducing the burden that communities that contribute the least to climate change crisis suffer the most. In the Nigerian context, this has just explores the intersections between how wealthy oil organizations or corporations degrade the environment of communities that do not get to enjoy anything out of this. Their environments are degraded, they get no voice, they get no say. They watch as their means of livelihood and living are wiped out before their very existence, and they seem to have nothing to say about it. So as long as these communities are still exploited for their resources in a way that damages their environments and impacts disproportionately on women and girls, then we cannot say that climate justice has happened. So all of our efforts geared at helping underprivileged and communities that cannot speak for themselves and suffer the most from climate change action is when we can, all our efforts at getting them at the table, getting them at the voice and protecting their environment as best as possible is action towards climate justice. Thank you very much.
Thank you, absolutely agree.
I echo everything that everyone else has said. Additionally, for me, I think coming from those, one of the first things I did was work with those who were starving and on starvation deaths as a young feminist. And I think those who are absolutely at the end of even all intersectionalities and in being excluded, coming in to decide how to live a dignified life, be able to interact with the climate and decide policies that govern their lives, to me would be real climate justice. You know, where we are looking at the most marginalized, those who even slipped through the right to life, being able to decide how to add, and which is mostly, again, these were Dalit communities I was working with, and Dalit children, adolescent girls included. So when they are able to come and decide how to administer the common property resources, how to administer, how they access water, food production systems, what you call in Hindi, it's called Jal Jangal Zameen, which means water, land, forest, which govern all of this. And also being able to decide and vision for the next generation, because those are the more, those who are actually custodians of, the common property resources are the ones who are going to be able to take this forward, and not those who've been destroyers of it, even in my own community. So I think that's where justice, it would move from climate action to climate justice when we start talking of the most marginalized at the intersections. And also justice would be understanding its overall impact on governance, understanding its impact on violence, especially on women and gender diverse people. Also understanding its impact on, education, not being able to access basic, health services. So when we start integrating all of these things is when we can move towards justice and not just climate change.
Thank you, Jeevika. And speaking of those intersections and those most marginalized by them, I think it's a great segue into the next part of some of the questions we had. Devin, if you could share our screen, we'd love for all of you here on the call, as well as our speakers, to take a look at some facts about the intersection of climate and equity. And these facts are displayed here on the screen. Some of them are a little heavy, but we would just like to take a minute or so for y'all to read, absorb some of it, and then speak to what these facts mean for you. What are your reactions? And on the whole, have you experienced these intersections in your own work? And I would just love to hear a general response, both from our speakers and from all of our attendees on the call. Please feel free to write down your response in the chat. So just taking a few seconds to read what's on here, and then we can open it up. Okay, we're continuing to hear from all our attendees in the chat. That is wonderful. Please feel free to keep plugging in your LinkedIn and any comments or questions that you may have for us or the speakers. But now I'd love to open the floor and hear from our speakers about what their responses or any comments that they would like to share.
Yeah, I think I'll start just kind of looking at the statistics here. Women have a heavy burden to bear, not in just the home, but also providing for and the security for our families. And so with that being said, anytime that there's a natural disaster, a mother or a woman is clearly put on the front line, is clearly put in jeopardy, clearly put in harm's way. And so with that being said, it is imperative for us to protect women, not because we are women on the call, but it is imperative for us to protect women. We are the ones who give life. And if we are extinct, if we're burned out, if we're in danger, how else will this world continue?
Hello, I would like to go next. So climate disasters have shown an increase in gender-based violence, including sexual harassment, domestic violence, child marriage, and human trafficking. Is it for me to relate so that in the sense that women are considered bottom tier in many societies, they already bear the burden in cases of scarcity, in cases of displacement due to famine, in cases of displacement due to terrorism. So climate change will only worsen these actions or these gender-based violence actions against women. So as long as women, as long as they are already in the bottom, they're already vulnerable to these conditions. I believe that climate disasters, climate crises, such as having to be displaced or migrate from their original communities to other communities, the response to say flooding, drought, the expansion of the Sahara Desert in the African context, we will see that there will be an increase of these actions against women, as long as they are considered, as long as they're in places of, or as long as they're considered vulnerable within their societies. So thank you.
Yeah, I think I was just looking at some of these facts, right? Like, for example, when we say the word farmer, who comes to your head? you have an image of a man, and yet we see that, I mean, in the South, this is just 43% here, but in countries like mine, we're looking at 75 to 79% labor force being women. Yet we think, when we think, women, we think of unpaid care work. We've got to start talking about unpaid non-care work as well. The double, triple, 10-time burden of poverty on women and, gender diverse groups who are excluded. And, when we're looking at that, our policies, our budgets, our finances are not going into that, while we're looking at, talking the larger language of loss, damage, green emissions. Where does the reality of, just disparity in basic work programs, social protection programs, health programs go? And I think when we don't finance climate change to look at all these issues, we're going to look at even, larger numbers of this disparity coming out. And of course, I mean, as we've seen, I worked with a community which it was a tribal community in Gujarat in India, the same state where our Prime Minister comes from. And this community earned about $2 to $4 a day on an average for a household. And we continuously had drought in that community. So the minute you had drought, people used to migrate, families migrated, entire villages were empty, and then they worked in these big industrial corporations, which are seen as the growing India, or, the growing Asian world. And, in all of this, where is the parity, and what is the sort of investment we're doing in securing even communities in their own traditional areas? And of course, violence increased, violence from the state, when they started accessing forests increased. So, the women I work with have been forest dweller communities, or, a different kind of women farmer, or those who access the coast, because the coast have become privatized. And, India has one of the largest coastlines in the world. And so and I'm sure you have the similar issues in your countries, but how do you also look at communities having more participatory, decentralized decision-making, and within that, positing women, who are the ones who access this, right? Men go into formal jobs, men are trying to make things work by going into government institutions, by trying to do different kinds of skilled work, but it's women who are actually looking at these sort of skills which relate to natural resources. So how do we also link it? And we're looking at continuous, cycles of droughts, cycles of floods, cycles of, even if you look at an urban population, we're looking, I mean, I come from one of the most polluted cities in the country, Delhi. We are looking, and that burden also, I can, now sit in my own house, but what about those who don't have safe infrastructure, safe spaces? So these statistics, of course, and we're looking at places like, I've lived 5 years where there was no water connection. With the communities I live with, I walked about a kilometer every day. And I mean, it's really, forget about toilets and all of that. So I think, what is this disparity and this mismatch when we're even investing in these, and how do we expect women or marginalized communities, young women, adolescent girls, to even think of lives where we're dreaming, where we're changing the discourse, or even knowledge production, which is understood by the rest of the world, when own systems are breaking down, and with a lot of state complicity. I said this in my country. So I think those are some of the issues, and it's to me, I'm sorry, I'm going to take 1 more minute if that's okay. When we are looking at injuries, we are also looking at those who protest against this. We know that 700 farmers died in India, out of which there were women, during the protests in the last 1 year. They stood the cold. They came to the streets of, and it's been the biggest protest in the world, and it's still, a climate change activist from Fridays for Future was arrested. She, of course, came into the news because she was a young person with a global impact, more urban, all of that. But where are all these people, who start speaking up against this? And what are the systems we're creating in our feminist justice world for such people to be able to even speak about these issues today, right? Bringing these up also seems to be a challenge. So I just wanted to speak to that.
Thank you, Jeevika.
I just wanted to bring attention to the Indigenous peoples again. And again, I'm not an authority as a non-Indigenous woman myself, but what I've learned from Indigenous leaders and advocates and storytellers is that there's a lot of deep sadness and anger and frustration when it comes to Indigenous populations and climate justice. I think, looking at that statistic there, saying how Indigenous people make up 5% of the world and maintain 80% of the planet's biodiversity is a shocking statistic, that they have such core stakeholders, and yet continuously continuously dispossessed from these democratic processes, but also dispossessed from the land, the traditional lands that they own. I know here in Australia, a major issue is recognising land ownership of Indigenous people here in Australia. And so yesterday, for those of you who don't know, it's a survival day in Australia, which is a day of mourning for Indigenous people. And we were at a rally and climate justice came up a lot, particularly that Indigenous people have been continuously fight to have their right to land recognised. And these are sacred sites for tens of thousands of years, which our states are continuously exploiting for fracking, for mining, for using for oil. And I think that has significant impact on Indigenous people, particularly, and contributes significantly to intergenerational trauma. So it's interesting how, like saying, even though that statistic is absolutely true, I think we again have to go back to, even whether you're Indigenous or non-Indigenous, go back to decolonizing our idea of climate justice, and recognizing that our knowledge has only taken us so far, and to really do what we can to elevate the voices of Indigenous people to be able to advance and realize climate justice for what it's meant to be.
Absolutely. Thank you, Alice.
I think I'd like to carry forward the conversation next. I have huge respect for what the rest of the speakers said, because for me personally, I think, unfortunately, I'm not surprised by these statistics, especially looking at the recent years and having my own personal experiences living next to the coast and seeing natural disasters strike every now and then. Unfortunately, I'm not surprised by these statistics, and I think that is a part of the problem, because that does normalize, the disparities that women face in the climate justice movement. And I kind of like speak about this because so I live in Kolkata, which is next to the coast, and if you've heard of the Sundarbans, which is actually one of the most biodiverse places on earth, and really so my like almost all generations of my family come from the Sundarbans. And unfortunately, in recent years, due to climate change, due to natural disasters, it's been so due to sea level rise, etc., it's disappearing, the Sundarbans. And that's a huge pain for me to see, because because the ones who are most affected are women, are indigenous women over here. And it's really sad because women actually play such a huge role in, cultivating and protecting Mother Earth. They play such a huge role in, farming, as Jeevika said so rightly, that, even though women over here said even less than 5%, 15% of agricultural land is held by women. Women play such a huge role in farming and other such industries, but the women's unequal participation in decision-making processes and such labor markets really compound these inequalities and prevent women from fully contributing to, climate-related planning, policy making, and implementation. And that is also part of the problem, because, if you do not include women in the decision-making process, you're actually not making effective change, because you're not including those opinions which really matter. And actually, women play such a critical role in response to climate change. They have such huge local knowledge. I mean, I see indigenous women in India, they really, their sustainable practices at household, at community level, the kind of ideas they have for sustainable resource management. I'm so confident that, if the governments, if the states, if really corporates listen to these women, we can actually achieve climate justice in just the next decades or so, because they have women's participation at political level actually results in greater responsiveness to citizens' needs, because really we really contextualize ourselves in their situation. They have faced all these problems themselves, and it's actually not right. It's actually also unfair to segregate them from the decision-making process, because they are the ones who are affected. And also I'd like to add that whenever we talk about climate change, also like whenever young girls speak up, especially, is actually kind of frowned upon. Especially, like, I remember some people spoke about the Fridays for Future movement, which is actually very prominent in India. And actually, so we go to rallies, etc., to just on the streets and raise awareness on climate change. And really, like, one experience I remember is that when we went, there were so like one of the teachers in our school, at least, they said that you should not be doing this. You should instead be focusing on your studies, because at the end of the day, you doing this will have no change at all. You're just one person. And it really hit me and my fellow girl friends. Like, it really hit us, because like, when you discourage girls from taking action, that's really, first of all, a huge discriminatory action. It's really not understanding the problem at hand as well, because gender and climate change go so hand in hand. And you should be empowering young girls especially to speak up about this. And really, we should be making these statistics completely unacceptable at the end of the day. So yeah, that's mine.
Completely agreed, Maneeza. Thank you for that. And all our speakers have spoken about the intersectional inequities that are part of the structures, the governance, our political and social landscape. Like Maneeza, you spoke about how even it's frowned upon for young girls to talk about culturally, about things that they want to change in the future. And we talked about everything from colonization to land rights to racial inequities to, of course, gender inequities, to the rights of Indigenous people, who are the custodians historically of the lands that are being exploited. There's so much to sink in, there's so much to talk about, and yet what all of these conversations, what they come down to is that there isn't enough participation of the people in decision-making spaces who are most impacted by the intersections of climate inequities. So I guess my next question for all of us here on this call, including our speakers, is how do we go about changing that? And specifically, what role can young people play in changing that? Because again, social, culturally, Maneeza, I'm going back to again what you said about your teacher trying to sanction you, and this is still a narrative that exists even in spaces such as the UN, where we think of young people as the future. It's something that's going to happen later on, that we can worry about later. It's something that they will inherit from us, but young people are actually in the present. They are being impacted by climate change now, and they need to be part of decision-making spaces. They need to have political, real power. They need to have their voices heard. So how do we go about bringing change, and how do we ensure that young people are a part of not even that discussion, but they are part of the solutions in bringing about that change? I see a couple of audience members have their hands up. We can first just let our speakers speak, and then we'll circle back if that works okay.
I think we have to start bringing our, not just women, but young people, our youth, to the table when it's time to make decisions. Ultimately, women and youth will be impacted the greatest. In order for a woman to give birth and have life, to produce more young people, she has to be at the table to talk about how these factors are affecting her. So having her at the table, when you typically talk about those that are creating the policies, those that have the platform, those that have the voice, the greatest voice, it's often typically white men, and they're being impacted the least. So why are they making decisions for women who have to be on the front line? Not only women, but young people who will actually have to bear the brunt of what we're doing today. There's an old proverb that I often quote when I'm doing training. We do not inherit the earth from our ancestors, but we borrow it from our children. So if we're borrowing earth from our children, why aren't they at the table? If we refuse to have them at the table, when it's time for them to make the decisions, how will they know if they weren't trained? So we have to have women and youth at the table and in positions of power so that they can make the decisions that affect them the most.
I agree with LaTisha. I am very happy that young people constitute a huge population in Africa. Africa is a young continent due to the population of its young persons. So what can young persons do to mitigate this problem? we must understand that in the Nigerian context, I'm going to use Nigerian context, many times young people are not brought to the table. Nobody advocates or pushes for young people like young persons. And I'm going to go to a totally unrelated issue. During when young persons in Nigeria had suffered police brutality, and they had come to a place where they could not take it any longer, they pushed for a protest that went worldwide. And the end of every successful advocacy protest, whatever it may be, is the development of a structure. Not development of promises, not giving of promises that no, things will change. Structure that supports them. So when we develop a structure that sees, even from community levels, that sees women have a say. We cannot continually have women in vulnerable conditions and have them remain in that condition. So a structure that supports women from communities, rural communities, because urban women might not understand, do not go through the same kind of life or go through the same, stories are different for urban and rural women, even within developing societies. So as long as we have structures that are developed to support women from whatever level they are in, the woman in, say, northern Nigeria, the woman in southern Nigeria, the woman that has a lot, and the woman that has so little, structures that support them, structures that have their back, then we can begin to speak of some solution. Then we can begin to say our advocacy is bearing some fruit. So I am for development of structure that supports young women, that supports young and vulnerable people in a place where they no longer are at the mercy of someone's call. They are no longer at the mercy of some decision makers. Young people are no longer at the mercy of some people deciding for them, but they have a seat on the table due to the structure that makes it a must that they have a say in the actions that affect their environment. It also helps me, my work as a comic artist puts this in for, we are in the process of putting information about gender-based violence and where to get help in the hands of young girls from, say, 12 years old. We no longer want them to look to an adult to get a solution for them. We want them to be able to directly connect to support organizations and see, like, I'm going through this, where do I get help? So it's no longer in the place of one person suddenly finding a young girl in the streets of Nigeria and being like, I want to help her. But she knows that there's a structure in place that when I communicate with this number or with this person in this organization, I get some help. So I believe that we should have structures that are strengthened enough to support women and girls in vulnerable communities. Thank you very much.
So I think the principles are simple, right? We can't say there's no more space at the table. We have to expand the table. We have to let them create the table. We have to let young people come in, and within that, I say intersections of young people, because those who are the most marginalized must be able to speak first, and those most affected, as they say, with an epistemic injustice against them, and also doing it with a decolonized approach, with an approach that actually allows for substantive participation and not tokenistic approaches of, we have a young person on the table, or we have someone who's affected the most by climate change physically on the table, but what does it mean to them? What if they change the way you do it? Are we going to, and this is not about a one-time participation, but funding those funding leadership, funding spaces, funding initiatives by young people and people at the margins, creating that space to have the dialogue of having to perhaps overturn things we've always understood, and also supporting them to be able to work with formal structures, bringing them into political structures, bringing them into negotiations, whether at the UN, whether at the country level. And all of this can only happen with a sustained investment, right? We are seeing that climate change had the least funding, and young people's organizations had the least funding when we speak about generation equality, right? So how are we going to bridge that gap? How are we going to actually allow for these things, which of course we speak about in manifestos, but how are we going to put, what they say, do you have a skin in the game? Are you going to come in and actually take those risks? And I think young people today are not moving beyond participation to say, we want to design, we want to co-create, we want to co-own. And within that, we want to make sure that those from the margins do it for us. And we're happy to sort of amplify their voices while they do it. So I think that's perhaps the only way forward. Otherwise, we're going to have the same conversations, because we're not the future, we're the current, right? To me, it's quite simple.
I just wanted to jump here and jump into what Jeevika was saying about co-design and co-ownership of these structures and processes for climate justice, and the importance of women leadership and youth leadership as well. And I'm going to bring it back to Indigenous justice as well within the climate environment, and it continuously, not only in Australia, but in other countries that have continuously discussed the First Nations of their country, particularly climate justice issues, is something that will always come back to. I kind of perhaps want to say something that doesn't always get brought to the table, and obviously participation is important and young people need to have voices involved, but I think it's important to also talk about the importance of humility in this space as well, particularly as non-Indigenous people. I think sometimes as a non-Indigenous person or as an ally within the climate justice space of Indigenous people, it's about having that humility to allow them to center the conversation, or to allow them to us to focus the conversation around them. As I said before, Indigenous populations have been looking after these lands for 10, 20, 30,000 years, more than that. They know this, they've been practicing this for years. And we spoke about structures and systems of how we can promote climate justice. And again, we can look for Indigenous communities there. Even if here in Australia, for example, we can look at the rule of law, which is the rule of LORE, not LAW, which was their own, how they manage their own climates and their lands. And I think we can learn a lot from that, which again, they've been dispossessed from. But I think in allyship, especially as young people and as women, it's about recognizing the gender vulnerability of those Indigenous women as well, and doing what we can as an ally to amplify their voices. And I think it's important to recognize that Indigenous people, like from what I've learned from leaders as well, they're not looking for saviors, then they're looking for allyship, they're looking for solidarity. And I think as young people and women in leadership, we recognize that, and we recognize the importance of it, and we're good at it. I mean, we have a long way to go, and we have a lot to learn from Indigenous communities and how to become better allies. But I think that's probably the most important thing that I think we should discuss as well, is humility in leadership, particularly in climate justice as non-Indigenous people.
I think I absolutely love what Alice and Jeevika just said, especially the fact that, having humility in this whole process is so important. And I also think about having resilience, I think I have definitely one message for the youth as a fellow youth myself, is to really have resilience and to not be hindered by the barriers in front of you. Because I feel like if me and my friends would have been stopped by that teacher, and if we would not, we would have doubted ourselves for capabilities and would not have gone forward to that rally that day, then we would not have been in the place we are today. Perhaps I would not be here speaking to all of you today. And I think that's why it's so important to for the youth especially to not be deterred by the problems, by what people think about you, because really the ones who doubt you are the ones who are scared of the power that you have inside you, of the power that you can bring about change. And that's why I think in this climate justice movement, it is also important to not underestimate what young people have inside them. We have so many ideas, we have so many innovative ideas. Of course, my biggest role model is Greta Thunberg, and I look at her and I see her passion and drive, and I see the representation of my fellow youth in the global platform that empowers me to do the work that I'm doing right now. And I think that is why it's so important for people to understand that young people really should come forward. You should listen to them, just give them a chance to speak, and you will see that how they'll just have so many beautiful ideas to really empower communities all over the world and to really drive forward the climate justice movement.
Can I just step in for a second, Maneeza? Absolutely, young people do have the power. Reiterating that, but I think towards the end of my youth, I stand at the intersections, and one of the things I think about is, when is the time when perhaps, Navli Bai, one of the biggest, Indigenous young people who's been fighting for her, river and fighting with the communities and has built some of the biggest collectives in India, would get the same space as a Greta. How do we, posit her knowledge at the same level as Greta? and also give the tables, give the seat to that, right? I think it's for young, old, for everyone to also reflect on who's sitting at the table while we create that space and who's missing at the table, perhaps, right? The table at the local and the global. And I think once we move from participation and voices to actually looking at intersections for justice, that's where perhaps we need to also problematize this. While we build the grand collectives, we also need to build the local collectives to perhaps lead the way for us. So again, one of the ways for this would also be, I mean, we've seen the strongest feminist collectives, women's collectives, indigenous collectives sort of leading the way, for those sort of conversations, especially at a state where, we've been criminalized for all of this. And they're the ones who have actually stood while we've, spoken about policy. So just wanting to center that. And I echo what you say, Alice. Yeah.
No. Thank you, everybody. And I apologize if I break off a little bit. My internet connection is being a little unstable. That was wonderful to hear from all of our speakers. I actually was trying to synthesize all these incredible points you all were making and try to put them together in some bullets that I'm going to share in the chat. But what I think we heard from most of our speakers is that one that I think stood out for a lot of us is that we need humility in this space, especially in allyship with Indigenous people. We need to be decolonizing the climate movement, and we need to be ensuring equitable participation of women, young people, especially those from Indigenous communities, expanding the table and co-designing the policies and systems with everyone at that table. We need to be enhancing collaboration between actors in this space, working on climate change and women's rights. We need to be promoting gender transformative climate action that addresses the linkages between climate change and intersections of health, GBV, economic security, land ownership, and more. And we need to be investing in research to fill evidence gaps and integrate the analysis of gender equity and climate data. And we need to be investing in natural disaster responses and systems that to address the underlying causes of vulnerability to climate change and gender inequality. And finally, we need a better understanding of how compounding crises and intersecting identities shape the vulnerability and resilience to climate change, and to make sure that climate actions do not exacerbate these existing inequities. So thank you for all of your voices. Thank you for being part of this discussion. I know we're near time, but this is such a fantastic discussion. So if you are able to stay on, please do. We have some hands raised as well. Laura, I saw that you had your hand raised. The floor is yours if you'd like to make a comment or if you have a question. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yes, I do wanted to add a couple of points because as an activist myself, by the way, I'm from Venezuela. I'm a UN Women activist, and I help mobilize young people for the Generation Equality Forum and also CSW. And I'm an NGO CSW, part of like the young professionals community, and I'm also an NYU student. From Venezuela, currently in the UAE. I wanted to add about youth representation in decision-making spaces, and now talking about climate change and gender equality. I feel like young people need to start being recognized as like political actors, because the problem so far has been that we get invited to events, we speak, they take pictures of us, but that's it. Like there's no long-lasting impact or involvement in negotiations that we can actually follow up on. And this of course affects the whole process of seeing the young people's representation in actual like policies and solutions. So there's that. And as a solution, something that I've been discussing with different ambassadors and activists, and something that could be a potential solution for this is actually having young people included in the ambassadors that every government includes for events like CUP, like CSW, because so far we just attend and we speak and we give speeches. But if governments start seeing us and treating us like political actors, then that's when we can actually have a long-lasting impact, which is what we want. As you were saying, the land that we currently have is like it belongs to our children, it belongs to youth, and not really to current generations who have the power and are managing it. So this has to be translated in actions, political actions, and not just speeches. So yeah, I just wanted to add that. Thank you.
Thank you for sharing that fantastic point, Laura, especially about the essential importance of young people as political actors and not tokenizing young people. It's just something with the YLYP program. We try through events such as these and our preparatory series to ensure that young people are not just there for a photo op or for a speech, but they are put into decision-making spaces with other political actors, and they get a chance to, again, be a part of the decision-making spaces, or at least be a part of that table, so that other actors with power understand why they need to be part of political and decision-making spaces. So thank you for that. And Mohammed, I see that you have your hand raised as well. The floor is yours.
Yes, thank you for the opportunity. I'm feeling so grateful right now to be a part of this conversation, because there were some superbly powerful points which were spoken and very inspiring. So this is what I wanted to say. I'm so glad that the topic youth came out, because I'm also a part of youth, and with all of us, we have different challenges. We come from different places from the globe, but we have one thing in common: the future, the youth of tomorrow, right? The part where we can actually focus on and create long-lasting, sustainable change by focusing on these youth who are going to, who is going to face the earth of tomorrow, the future where we are going to live in. And that is what even I do right now. I'll quickly introduce myself. My name is Mohammed. I am a change maker at the Cornef Foundation. This is my second year I'm participating with my organization at the UNCSW. As last year also I was participating with my organization. So I'm really glad. And we too invest in youth, empower them, uplift young girls, young male, everyone to be the next leaders, next generation who will take up, will take our country forward, who will take the earth forward into making it a beautiful place. And so glad that you all gave me the opportunity to speak, and we'll meet again and again in different speak-ups. Thank you so much. We too are presenting this year.
Thank you, Mohammed. We're so excited to see you at CSW just in a few months. It's just a few months away. And thank you again to all of our speakers, to all of our participants for being here and participating in this space. And thank you, Mohammed, for raising that point about that we may come from different spaces, that we may come from different countries, different experiences, different causes that we passionately support, but Earth is our home. It's going to be our future. It is our present, and we need to be working now to ensure its safety and ensure that those most marginalized by the impacts of climate change are the ones that are leading decision-making spaces in helping us protect the only planet we have, this Earth. So thank you all for being here. I'm going to now pass it on to, I believe, Safira, to help us close off this wonderful meeting and to let you all know what's coming up next with the YLYPs. Again, this discussion will be uploaded onto YouTube, and we'll be sharing it more broadly. And again, thank you to all our incredible speakers for being there. This was an inspiring conversation. Thank you all.
Thank you, Saida, and likewise, just really wanted to echo so much appreciation for the speakers and for everyone who joined today. Just to highlight a couple of events that are coming up for this series. Many of you are familiar, but the youth leaders and young professionals are holding a series. So every Wednesday at the same time for the next 6 weeks now, in the lead up to the commission, we will have an event that is designed to prepare us to engage at the commission. And so these events are specifically designed to kind of look at certain dimensions, to give us certain skills just in preparation to engage constructively at the commission. So next week, we're actually going to be doing a UN advocacy training. So for those who've never attended the Commission on the Status of Women before, this is the space for you. We'll be looking at what the commission is, how it's structured, how to engage, what are some specific opportunities for young people. Both NGO CSW and UN Women are going to be convening certain youth spaces during the commission. So if you'd like to learn more about the Commission on the Status of Women, how it works and how you can engage. Next week is for you. The following week, we have a mentorship space, and we've been able to invite some quite high level actors. So we have the former president of the General Assembly, Maria Fernanda Espinosa. We have Asa Regner, who is currently an Assistant Secretary General for UN Women, and she's the former Minister of Gender Equality for Sweden. We, of course, have our chair of NGO CSW, Huri Gudalekian. We have Azza Karam, who's currently the Secretary General of Religions for Peace. So those are just 4 of, we're hoping to have over the course of this year, 50 mentors who are going to be committing to supporting young people, to supporting the next generation of activists to engage at the UN. So on the 9th of February, again, at the same time, this will be an informal meet and greet. So we'll be convening on Remo as a platform, which those of you who've been on that platform, you'll know it's like a little networking space where you can kind of virtually attend different tables and have smaller discussions. And we specifically wanted to create this space because so often when you're engaging online, there's a lot of listening. You're kind of watching a presentation, your camera is off. It's hard to get a voice in and ask just some of the questions that might be on your mind. So we're really trying to create a mentorship space that can be informal, where you can have a chat, you can kind of meet in a similar way that we would if we were in person. So take a note of that. And then you can see the list of other things that are coming up in this series, but those are the next 2 on the list. Feel welcome to share with others who you think might be interested in learning more about the UN and engaging and connecting in these ways. So with that, I will say thank you so much. And Devin has put the link again in the chat for those who are interested in registering for future preparation series events. And we look forward to seeing you next week. Thank you all.